Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is April 1st, 2022, and this weekend we're doing a bunch of Hangin with the Sockdem Gang clips in which I comment on basically channels that Kyle Kulinski links to from his YouTube. I go through their most recent videos and see, what, if anything, grabs me, and then I do some commentary on them from a Marxist perspective, trying to contrast an actually socialist perspective from more of the social democratic or SocDem reformist type of viewpoint. So far this weekend, I've done one from Kyle Kulinski, one from David Pakman, and this is installment number 3, Thom Hartmann, with a video titled Biden's Billionaire Tax is Just the Start. So from that title, I assume that he is trying to push the idea that Biden's just getting revved up to make all kinds of major changes to the U.S. tax code, and maybe even will throw some more crumbs to working people. Really, not much has been done so far in that direction in the first year plus that Biden has been in office. But yeah, no, he's just getting warmed up, folks. Just in time to lose the 2022 election, he is going to attempt a few more things half-heartedly, and then they will fail, and that will be that. So, from what I understand of Biden's proposed billionaire tax, it is the very definition of tinkering around the edges. He tried something similar last year. It didn't pass through Congress. And there are a number of things, like he wants to raise the corporate tax from 21 to, hold on, 28%, which is still 7 points lower than the 35% top rate that was in place before the Republicans did the cuts. So, again, tinkering. Will any of this substantially change anything? He wants to make CEOs wait 3 years before selling their shares back to the company when a buyback is announced. So, again, tinkering around the edges. Nobody in the working class is going to feel any of this. It's just the U.S. empire needs funding. Like, they need money to run the empire, and they got to raise it somehow. Will they use the money to fund things that working people actually want? No, they'll do things that are in the capitalist class's interest. And as we know, the capitalist class's interest, they're the people who own capital, industry, run it for profit, etc. Their interests are diametrically opposed to and in antagonism against the interests of the working class. That would be you and me and most of the other 90+% of people in the country. Between these two great classes, the working class, who do not own capital but are great due to our numbers, and the capitalist class, who are small in numbers but great due to their wealth, they basically own everything. There's also a small petty bourgeois or petty capitalist class, people who own some capital but not that much. This class is shrinking, and it's neither great in number nor in wealth, so it can only get things done by aligning either with the big capitalists or with the proletariat, and that's how it expresses itself politically. Otherwise, there is a class struggle that goes on between the capitalists and the working class. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are funded by and represent the capitalist class. That's why nothing ever really changes. They just represent different styles of running capitalism for capitalists. Working people, this is not in our interest. So anyway, I guess with this laid out, like, last year, Biden wanted to raise the top federal tax rate from 37% to, hold on, 39.5%. Wow. I'm sure that would be, just send shockwaves across the whole country. Come on. This is, the guy that the Democrats put up so that nothing would fundamentally change. And that's basically what's been happening so far. They're afraid that they're going to lose in the 2022 midterms, or at least their earnest supporters fear that. The people who control both parties know power just goes back and forth between the two parties, and the big capitalists always come out on top because that's what the system is designed to do. Neither party really represents any opposition to the rule of capital. So as socialists, though, that's what we're trying to push. This has to happen outside the Democratic Party, and the U.S. left fundamentally needs to break from the Democratic Party and from all capitalist parties. Until this is done, really no effective independent opposition can be mounted, which is what we need. We need militant class struggle, yes, in the electoral system, but also and mainly outside the electoral system. But anyway, Thom Hartmann, not really on that team. Let's hear what he has to say to hype up the same Biden administration that is, fishing for quarters between the couch cushions, basically, at this point, trying to have the IRS monitor all transactions over $600, for God's sake. Stalwart defender of the status quo, Joe Biden. Let's hear what Thom Hartmann has to say about this anti-progressive, pro-capitalist enemy of the working class.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Taxes, after all, are the dues that we pay for the privilege of membership in an organized society. And as society becomes more civilized, government, national and state and local, is called on to assume more obligations to its citizens. The privileges of membership in a civilized society have vastly increased in modern times. But I am afraid we have many who still do not recognize their advantages and want to avoid paying their dues.
There you go. So here's the situation. Back in the day, back in the 1930s, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously said, actually it was 1944, he said, we must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. He was right. And Americans in 1930, in the election of 1932, Roosevelt took office in March of 1933. Americans chose democracy over great wealth. And Franklin Roosevelt put into place a 91% top income tax bracket. Now, doesn't mean everybody paid 91%. You only paid that after you made millions of dollars a year. And a 48% top corporate income tax bracket. Again, only the very, very small handful of most profitable corporations would have even paid that. But with the money from those taxes, during the 46 years from the time that Franklin Roosevelt was elected until the time that Ronald Reagan came into office, we got from the Democrats, the Republicans opposed every single one of these things. We got Social Security, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, world-class public schools, nonprofit requirements for hospitals and health insurance companies, free to very inexpensive state colleges, the right to unionize, civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation, publicly owned utilities, new highways and airports, quality mass transit, antitrust laws to maintain competition and protect small businesses, Medicare, the Environmental Protection Agency, Medicaid, school lunch programs and food stamps, workplace non-discrimination for women and racial minorities, tax deductibility for interest payments on car loans and credit cards, federal deposit insurance to protect people from bank failures, Head Start, and literally hundreds of laws that protected consumers and the environment from corporate predation and dangerous products. As Franklin Roosevelt said,
on the one hand...
Okay, pause. Before we go back to what FDR said, and I'm really not sure what exactly that has to do with Joe very much not FDR Biden is doing now. But anyway, what I'd like to say is that while a lot of the facts about the laws and programs that were passed is accurate, this is overall a false narrative. What Thom Hartmann is describing here is what we refer to as the golden age of social democracy, from the reforms in the 1930s up through the 1970s and the beginning of the neoliberal conservative counter-revolution. Yes, there were a lot more social programs, there was more taxation, there was less wealth inequality. In other words, the top and the bottom were better compressed so that the low wasn't as low and the highs weren't as high. In many ways, it was easier to exist as a working person economically, though there are caveats to that as well, particularly around race, sex, gender, things that were dealt with more in the late 60s, 70s, New Left period. A lot more ground was broken then. For one example, second wave feminism, for all of its liberal trappings, initiated things that most of us probably take for granted today. Like, for example, married women couldn't open bank accounts without their husband's permission. Just as one small anecdote. The unfortunate thing is that as struggles pivoted more, having won these economic gains and some economic rights, as struggles pivoted to topics of this type, then the economic rights came under attack. Economic rights that had just been won a few decades prior and that probably a lot of people thought were pretty much set in stone. Well, they weren't. And during the neoliberal period, they came under heavy assault. Now we're back to a situation where we're fighting for example, rebuilding the labor movement and all kinds of other stuff to get the minimum wage raised again, all kinds of things. So yes, that's true. There was a golden age of social democracy, and yes, it started during the FDR 30s. Where this narrative becomes false is that it's about privileges of membership in an advanced society with taxes as dues, and that whole thing about democracy or, quote, wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Now, as a socialist, I would say that the more accurate way to say that doesn't involve all the sort of verbal gymnastics of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. It's democracy or capitalism, because capitalism is inherently undemocratic. But the false narrative here is that social democracy or fettered capitalism, regulated capitalism with redistributive social programs, that is democracy, and that is effectively addressing the wealth concentrated in the hands of a few question. That dynamic continues to exist even in regulated capitalism. The whole question of empire, of needing to keep opening new markets, to bring in raw materials, to export capital, all that stuff, that goes on even under regulated capitalism. The Vietnam War, for example, that was during the golden age of democracy. All the anti-communist wars like Korea, terrible, absolutely terrible stuff. Some of the worst things the U.S. has ever done in a long list of terrible things that the U.S. has done. This is what capitalism needs, and reforms should never be viewed as anything more than temporary measures, stepping stones on the road to revolution, because the reforms can only go so far before what working people need can only be accomplished by abolishing capitalism beyond the limits of capitalism, by taking power away from capitalists, not just political power, but the actual laws that allow people to employ people, to own industry privately, to operate it for profit, etc. All that needs to be dismantled, and the capitalist state, which was set up to administrate and expand that system as well, eventually needs to be replaced. Just as capitalism supplanted feudalism, so does socialism need to supplant capitalism. So this false narrative put out by FDR social democrats is that they, by making some reforms to the capitalist system, had effectively addressed the problems of capitalism, and they had created democracy by, breaking up some of these concentrated pockets of wealth, but not really, because the capitalists still owned industry. They were still accumulating capital, they were still exploiting workers, yes, with more rules to how that exploitation would go, but the capital accumulation kept going on. The political power that they hold in the system continued to exist. And then they just waited and they picked their day to launch the counter-revolution. And so they started to do that in the 70s. And then in the 80s, we had Reagan, which was like the full court press and really the unveiling of the new level of capitalist assault on all the rights that workers had won. Why? Because the capitalists were still sitting in their throne. Yes, workers had tied them to the throne, but why'd you leave them in the throne? Because from that position, they still had the power to get free eventually. This is an incomplete revolution. I mean, it's not a revolution at all if a new class doesn't take power, and indeed it had not. Trying to put some restraints on the king doesn't mean that the king has been overthrown. So the reforms that were supposed to just be temporary stepping stones on the road to actual working class power, deposing capitalists from ruling society, they were treated as the end product, and that's how social democrats tend to look at reforms. In the end, they just want capitalism with more rules on the capitalists. But the problem is that capitalists rule capitalism, and they are very quick to throw off those rules and those restraints as soon as they feel that politically they can get away with it. We are now 40 years into that time period where they felt like they could do the full assault on workers' rights, and we're now wallowing at the bottom. Now, these recordings of FDR that Thom Hartmann is playing, is he seriously going to try to segue into, and Biden is going to be the next great reformer? I mean, again, we need reform as stepping stone to a workers' state, the end of capitalism entirely. Now, as far as the masses of working people, I'm a socialist who has studied the history and theory of these things. As far as the masses of working people, they need to come around to this on their own. Obviously, we're here trying to aid with that education. But you can't do it all at once. You use reforms as propaganda in the struggle and say, well, we pushed for this, but we got this because of the capitalists. Ultimately, we need to get rid of capitalism. But let's keep pushing, and we got this reform. And we could have gotten more, but the capitalists in their way. And eventually you raise enough support for, hey, we should just get rid of the capitalists. Well, the USA never fully got to that point. They never got rid of the capitalists, never had a workers' revolution. And the Social Democrats are trying to frame that as like, oh no, if you have a workers' revolution, you've gone too far. Well, that's the reason their restraint on socialism, basically, is the reason that we are in neoliberalism today, and that there has been such a backslide in workers' rights all over the world. In countries that had a workers' revolution, many of those revolutions have been undone. For example, the USSR and Eastern Europe. And then in countries that haven't had a workers' revolution, there's been a backslide in rights, whether it's, healthcare systems being underfunded. The rallying cry of neoliberalism, the counter-revolution, is defund, deregulate, privatize. Same thing the libertarians say. Had we had a socialist revolution in the United States earlier, rather than just this, social democratic reforms taken as the end stage of the process of struggle, then maybe the United States, which has been actively sabotaging and launching wars against every socialist and quasi-socialist power in the world for decades, maybe that wouldn't have existed. Maybe it would have become a worker state, and it could have been cooperating with the Soviet Union, with Eastern Europe, with China, Vietnam, rather than launching a disgusting war against Vietnam. And the same thing in Korea, etc., on and on and on. So this quote, advanced society that the Social Democrats say, oh, we got to pay taxes as dues to be in that advanced society. That same advanced society went around the world trying to tear down workers' accomplishments everywhere it went. Why? Capitalist profit. So the capitalists could go into those countries, open markets, exploit resources, and just generally wreak havoc. It's an engine of exploitation. So question 2 is Biden even a social democrat? Or is he more of a conservative, defender of the neoliberal status quo? Definitely the latter. So not only is social democracy not a good position, it is far too limited when it comes to class struggle. You don't stop at just some reforms and restraint for the reasons that we've already discussed, as well as when they start making concessions, it means that they're afraid. That's why they make the concessions. So don't stop at take the concessions, but keep going. It means that you've got them where you want them. Don't stop. But anyway, yeah, is Biden even a social democrat? Is he the new FDR? As Bernie Sanders was saying, Biden will be I'm just tired of doing my Bernie Sanders voice. Biden will be the most progressive president since FDR. Well, what's he waiting for? Come on. He's the guy that they put up so that nothing would change. That's Biden's whole deal. Okay, well, we got about half of this clip left. I swear Thom Hartmann's core audience must be extremely gullible boomers. I don't know who else is buying this stuff.
In a vast majority of citizens who believe that the benefits of democracy should be extended and who are willing to pay their fair share to extend them. And on the other hand, there has been a small but powerful group which has fought the extension of these benefits because it did not want to pay a fair share of their costs.
And we're there right now. Joe Biden is proposing this 20% unavoidable tax on billionaires, and they're saying, oh, no, that's... And we'll revisit this at the top of the hour, but as Michael Hiltzig notes in his book, The New Deal, A Modern History, quote, the WPA, the World Works Progress Administration, produced, among many other projects, 1,000 miles. Now, this was all from that 91% income tax, right? The WPA produced 1,000 miles of new and rebuilt airport runways, 651,000 miles of highway, 124,000 bridges, 8,000 parks, 18,000 playgrounds and athletic fields, some 84,000 miles of drainage pipes, 69,000 highway light standards, 125,000 public buildings, and among the latter were 41,300 brand new schools. As Franklin Roosevelt said,
our present emergency...
Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one.
But you would think, to hear some people talk, that those good people who live at the top of our economic pyramid are being taxed into rags and tatters. But what is the fact? The fact is that they are much further away from the poorhouse than they were in 1932. And you and I know that as a matter of personal observation.
And today, the billionaires made $1.7 trillion just during the pandemic, as FDR said.
A number of my friends who belong in these very high upper brackets have suggested to me on several occasions of late that if I am re-elected president, they will have to move to some other nation because of high taxes here. Now, I will miss them very much.
And there you go. As the headline over at Time magazine reads, quote, the top 1% of Americans have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90%, and that's made the U.S. less secure. Franklin Roosevelt was absolutely right, and Joe Biden is channeling him right now, and thank God.
Wow. So actually, though, I couldn't help but notice the clips that Thom Hartmann was playing were not of Joe Biden. Is there a reason for that? Is there a reason he wasn't like, here's what FDR said, now here's how Biden's saying the same thing? Yeah, I think because Biden isn't saying the same thing. Let alone that what FDR was saying was, again, the false narrative of social democracy. So, to be blunt, FDR talking about, quote, democracy, that's just inaccurate. Social democracy is not actual democracy, because when social democrats say democracy, they mean capitalism. They basically lie to people saying that capitalism is economic democracy, because anybody can go out there and start up a business. But we know something about capitalism as Marxists, and this has been borne out time and time again in society after society. Capitalism just goes forward, okay? As Marxists, we use a system called historical materialism or dialectical materialism, which describes how technology changes over time and society changes with it. Basically, the things that we need to create the stuff that we need materially, society revolves around that, and people make up social orders to basically manage the property that we generate. So hundreds of years ago in feudalism, we had a certain level of technological development, and that called for a certain type of civilization and a certain type of social order. Then, as technology advanced, different financing methods emerged to deal with it. Capitalism came out of this. I'm really giving the broad strokes here. The point is, the emerging capitalist class, which was created by the conditions of feudalism, overthrew feudalism. Just as capitalism creates the proletariat, a huge mass, it's the overwhelming majority of the population in capitalist societies. The longer capitalism runs, the more people become proletarianized, the bigger the proletariat becomes. And that class of people, the proletariat, not owning capital, has no interest in maintaining a system that is based around capital because they don't own any. We don't own any. Our interest is not in maintaining a for-profit, privately run system of industry. Our interest is in abolishing privately run industry and profit and running industry collectively for the benefit of all. Because we're the people, we're the class that capitalism created. And that's all it can do, is create this very large class of propertyless people called the proletariat. This was true back in the 1930s. It's been borne out today. It's still just as true today. And that process of proletarianization is even further along. The process of capital consolidation into fewer and fewer hands, bigger and bigger monopolies, is further along. It's not economic democracy. You can't just go open a business like you could in 1920 or 1930 because you're going to immediately get wiped out by an Amazon or something like that. This is capitalism. This is what it does. In the early days, it's a progressive force. It's overthrowing feudalism, and it's introducing new conditions, and it's bringing technology into the rural areas, and it's actually making life somewhat more interesting. Its needs for a at least somewhat educated workforce lead to people who previously would have gotten no education getting some education, and on and on. But then it hits a certain point where it starts to stagnate. And we hit that point a long time ago, and now it's time to move on. Social Democrats, even in the 1930s, were reactionary compared to the possibility of socialism. Today, they're even more reactionary. Capitalism is less a kind of democracy than it ever was, to the extent that that sort of small proprietor capitalism from a century ago, could even be remotely termed that. To paraphrase Marx, people will bristle, critics of socialism will bristle at the idea of abolishing private property. The reality is that for most people, even under capitalism, private property does not exist. It was already abolished for the great mass of people. So most people never really have any hope of becoming a capitalist. That's capitalism. So what we do have a hope of, and a possibility of doing, is abolishing private property, and then we all can live in a cooperative society. It's not going to be like a perfect utopia. It's still Earth. It's still dealing with people, and it's still dealing with the legacy of capitalism and the broken society that we'll inherit. But under capitalism, it's just going to stay broken. Under socialism, we can at least start to fix it. Social democracy is just another concession. It's just a way for capitalists to hang on to power. It's a limited hangout. It's when capitalists don't want you to do revolution and put them out of power, they suggest social democracy instead. It's an obstacle. So, okay, that was a nice list of accomplishments that Thom Hartmann read out. And we would have had the same and more under socialism. Why keep the capitalists around when the only thing that makes them capitalists is a set of laws that said that they can own industry as private property, industry that they themselves cannot operate on a one-on-one basis. It's necessarily collective property because industry takes hundreds and thousands of people to operate a plant or factory, larger workplace, whatever. That should not be held privately by one or two people or a small group of capitalists. That should be collective property. When we say abolish private property, that's what we mean. Property that is held legally as private, but which in reality is not private. It requires whole groups of people to use it. It's not personal property. Socialists don't want to abolish personal property. You have your shoes. Those are your shoes. They're for personal use. You can actually use those as an individual. But a workplace that needs 10 or a dozen people minimum to operate, that's not private property. That's of necessity something that belongs to a group. Yet legally, capitalism says an individual can own it. And if the collective tries to claim ownership over it, then the police come in and the courts get involved, because that's what makes a capitalist, is the threat of force upholding a system of private property. That's what we as socialists want to get rid of. So even FDR in that clip, talking about the economic pyramid, why should we have an economic period? Like, what's the rationale? What's the justification? There is none. Like, even if you're going to have some kind of a pay gradient in society for super hard, high skilled jobs versus, whatever, 5 to 1, 3 to 1, that's still a lot. Today, we've got things like 200 to 1, 300 to 1. That's what we actually have now because capitalism goes forward. That's what we were talking about before. The longer you run capitalism in your society, it proletarianizes, it creates a bigger and bigger wealth divide. And you can't just keep turning back the clock on that. You can't just keep regulating it. You can't just keep breaking up the trusts. It doesn't work like that. If you leave capitalists in power, if you leave the laws on the books that allow for industry to be run as private property, that allow for the basics of capitalism, the mechanisms of the system to go forward, the capitalists will always accumulate more and more power as time passes. Only socialism goes beyond this system and enters the construction of a classless society, free of these antagonisms, ruled by the working class, for the first time, a situation where the ruling class is also the majority class. That is the basis where you can start getting into real justice in a society, not this whole pay a fair share and all this other shit that FDR is talking about. Those were political slogans designed to mislead working people about the basic nature of the progression of capitalism over time and what is necessary to escape its oppression. It was cover for capitalism to try to save that system, which can't be saved, doesn't deserve to be saved, but can't be saved in the end. It bought capitalism more time, and what did capitalism do with that time? It gave birth to fascism in different forms in all different parts of the world. It attacked workers' rights over and over again. It attacked people who were trying to create a peaceful future free of class conflict. It created the neoliberalism that we are currently suffering through. So hopefully you didn't fall for Thom Hartmann's little commercial for social democracy and FDR, let alone step 2, which is like trying to get you to believe that Joe Biden somehow is FDR. I think that requires a leap that even Thom Hartmann was not prepared to attempt in this clip. Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there, as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month, or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They are also materially helpful, so I do really appreciate all of the contributions. They've allowed me to produce a lot more content than I would have been able to do without this support. So if you like this channel, thank me, of course, but thank a patron as well. And again, consider becoming one. Otherwise, liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting on the videos in the channel is also helpful for boosting it in the YouTube algorithm, helping more people to stumble across this content. It's what this channel is all about. We're trying to make actual socialist, Marxist content more accessible to people, easier to just stumble across in life in the usual search for political knowledge and answers to social questions. So I appreciate your support both through the Patreon and through the engagement with the channel. Thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video.